right, welcome everybody to this episode of Director's Cut with myself and my co-host Drew Fry, who is my co-director at IUS TV Sports. And this week we have a very special guest with us, Dr. Lauren Smith. Thank you for joining us. How are you today?
I'm good. Thanks for having me.
Dr. Smith is one of the leading professors at Indiana and just does great work with gender inequality studies, and really everything having to do with sports and the issues within that world. I mean, you do so much, it's hard to sum it up in a title.
I do. But no, you were right. Gender inequality, different portrayals of athletes in the media, the effect those have on us. And recently I've moved into, athlete activism and the perception of athletes acting as activists.
Right. And you told us you were writing for a book about COVID testing and athletes coming back to campus. And that's kind of what we want to start with talking to you about. Colleges are coming back and bringing their athletes back for workouts and getting ready for the season, mainly football programs, other athletes as well. But some schools are having success. Like here at Indiana, they've reported 0 cases so far. And that was a couple of days ago, the last they've said anything about it. But then there are schools like UCLA where the athletes are requesting third-party witnesses to their practices because they don't trust the administration to have the athletes' health in their best interest. And just kind of go into what it's like right now.
It's a hard situation, and nobody has the answers. There isn't a clear answer. There's not a playbook that spells out what to do in this kind of situation because we've never seen it before. The UCLA athletes saying we don't have trust in the administration was a really powerful statement to come out and say. Very risky on their part, right? As a student athlete to come out and say, we don't trust our administration. But, when you look at both sides of the coin, when you look at it from the athletics perspective, of course, everybody wants to play and everybody wants to come back. And you guys both took my 218 class. And I always started off saying, imagine a world without sports. And now I feel bad because here we are. So we want sports to come back, right? Because that's a sign of a functioning society. It means normality. It means routine, all of these things that we put in sports. So, from that perspective, fan and athlete alike, we want this to come back. We want it to be done safely. In the economic sense, though, when we're seeing all of these articles coming in about how much money the NCAA stands to lose if football doesn't happen, how much money the NCAA stands to lose if basketball doesn't happen, how much they lost with March Madness. We're seeing programs cut across the country. That's sort of the state of where we are. And, as coming back, especially as we're seeing more and more football programs reporting positive cases, right? LSU had 30-something football players. Clemson, I think, is up to 47. Those seem to be the leaders right now. It's, I think, really imperative that we question, why are we doing this? And should we be doing this at this point?
Right, and you mentioned a really great point is athletic programs are getting cut across the country. The biggest example for me is UConn. They're cutting 4 or 5 sports because of the money they've lost. And the NCAA talking about March Madness, not being able to play that. They've lost millions and millions of dollars. I mean, at this point, it seems like they're coming back just to save money and make sure they're not going to go under. But like you said, just programs coming back and having issues. Kansas State, they came back and had 2 and then 4, and then it just exploded to where they had to shut down their workouts. Mm-hmm. Drew, do you have anything?
Yeah, I mean, to build off that, I just saw today where there was an athlete in Arizona where, one of the officials in Arizona says, I don't know if I would feel comfortable bringing students back to campus right now. And then the student athlete says, well, why am I here? Because student athletes are already coming back. I remember back in like March or April, someone at Oklahoma State made the comment of like, oh, our athletes are in good shape, they're of high health, it shouldn't be an issue for them. But then at what point are we, throwing our athletes out there and just disregarding their own health and safety? And then obviously there will be some people with issues. So I feel like there's a lot of moving pieces here. But yeah, I mean, the entire country in general wants sports back, whether it's due to just like the hobby of it, entertainment purposes, or from a financial standpoint, because it does have a large financial swing. But we do have to start looking at how much are we willing to risk and whose needs go ahead of others.
So Oklahoma State was the head coach. It was Mike Gundy who
There
said
you go.
that, our athletes are 18 and even if they get it, they're able to fight it off. And in that same press conference, he talked about how much money Oklahoma State football, right? How much money football brings into the state of Oklahoma. So you've got that on one hand. And then on the other hand, he's like, revenue and dollars. You're going, well, are you really acting in your athlete's best interest? Or are you thinking of the dollars and the bottom line? And
Right.
now we've had positive cases at Oklahoma State. So good job, Mike Gundy.
Right. And Oklahoma's right next to Texas, who's having one of the biggest spikes in the country. So who's to say it doesn't spill over into that state and take over? Texas is a program getting hit really hard too, which makes sense since Texas is on such an upswing. I haven't seen any numbers coming out of Florida myself, but I'm sure it can't be great. Even we talked about Alabama has had positive cases, then they have been kind of quiet about it ever since they reported positive.
Yeah, the latest I saw about Florida was they have more cases than Europe, I believe.
Oh, the state itself, right? Yeah.
Yes, right. So, don't have the exact number, but not good. We can at least say that.
Not good and rising to even more not good.
Right.
Exactly.
And it's kind of scary because the South is where college football is the biggest. So
Right.
Florida, Georgia, Alabama, those are the states that are going to be hit the hardest. South Carolina is sneakily one of the states getting hit the hardest, and they're another SEC school. And I mean, at some point, do the conferences have a responsibility to step in and say, okay, that's enough? Or do they not?
And that's something I've wondered too, because I know on the West Coast, at least early on, it seemed like several states were trying to be a little more proactive with it. And there were some questions of whether the Pac-12 would have some issues, if Oregon or, Southern Cal or Washington weren't going to be able to play. But now we're seeing a lot of the spikes being an SEC and Big 12 country. And at least in my own head, I think that if some of these conferences do decide to step in, I think that once either the SEC or Big 12 goes down, that will be it for the rest of the season. I could see the SEC continuing to play if the Pac-12 decides to drop some teams. I've nothing against the Pac-12. I just don't think it would have that big of a national impact. But I think the moment the SEC says we can't do it, the Big Ten's like, fine, we won't even try,
Right. And then with football being impacted so hard, does this impact the coming basketball season? Because the basketball season runs through when the second wave is supposed to be coming through. So do they even attempt to make a basketball season happen? Or should they?
Two different questions. I think they will. Again, we're back at this point of we just don't know. We've got some ideas of what can help stop the spread, right? Wearing masks and social distancing. And, I think with the right modifications in place, it could come back. But I don't even think you can speculate about basketball at this point, because I think you have to get through the fall sports first. I read an article this morning that talked about the NCAA Football Oversight Committee has put forth their recommendations of how to start the season. And it's basically a 6-week restart plan starting on July 15th. And in that, they mandate that each team has to have a minimum of 4 weeks practice before they start. And they said that will change from, conference to conference, because conferences may be on different timelines and even teams within that conference. So, Indiana may hopefully keep no cases coming out. They'll be fine. They get their 4 weeks. They start on week 1, but Michigan numbers are on the rise. So what if Michigan sets back 2 weeks? Now they can't start till week 2. How does that all start working and shuffling around?
Right. And just to go from there into, again, the money argument, I'm looking at Indiana basketball's Twitter right now, and they've got a tweet up that says renew your season tickets now for 2020, 2021. Mm-hmm. And to me, it seems like they're 100% going ahead with the assumption that it's happening. They just posted a video, Anthony Leal and Jordan Geronimo, two of the new freshmen. They already moved into town and are going to start working out. So I think they're going to go until they're absolutely shut down and told they cannot go, which it goes to the question of should they, which, probably not.
Yeah. I mean, from the money perspective, the NCAA stands to benefit less from football season because they don't have the television rights to the bowls and the championships. So while they do get a substantial amount of revenue over football, basketball is the NCAA money driver, right? NCAA owns the rights to March Madness and all of that. So if you're looking at money and you're questioning money, then my thought is with the NCAA and how careful and conscientious they are with their student athletes, and I'll pause to roll my eyes, my thought is they're going to try and do that at almost at any cost. Because how do you take two hits 2 years in a row that big?
I don't see them willingly losing a whole season after they lost their tournament.
No.
And then maybe they'll do a modified tournament if they have to cancel the basketball season. They're going to find a way to get basketball played. And healthy or not, I mean, the whole argument of they're young and the virus doesn't affect them as much, I think a good example of that being not a great argument is world-class health NBA player Rudy Gobert has come out and said he still hasn't fully recovered from the virus, and he got it right at the onset of the pandemic, starting in the United States. And if one of the world's best athletes isn't fully recovered of it, who's to say an 18-year-old freshman who's supposed to be the basketball star gets it? Who's to say he's going to recover from it? Or your quarterback or anybody?
Yeah. And one of the big issues with that is, again, it's all this that we don't know. And the more we go on, the more we're learning about long-term complications and long-term damage. And I don't think we really hear enough about those middle cases of, well, they got coronavirus, but they didn't end up in the hospital. But if you read any accounts, and it's not just Rudy Gobert, it's several former athletes that have tested positive have come out and said, this is terrible. But you're talking about long-term lung damage, blood clots, stroke issues, pancreas damage is something else I saw. Sure, you might be 18, but what happens if you get this and all of a sudden you have 50% lung capacity for the rest of your life? That's not a good thing.
Right. And
not only that, but even of the stuff that we do know of how it can impact high-risk patients, there will be some athletes that fall into that category, so we're just throwing them out into the wind. But on top of that, for something like the NBA restart, they're going to go play in that bubble. They'll be down there, a month or so, and then, they'll quarantine themselves, they'll go home, they'll move on with their lives. But for a student athlete playing an entirety of a football season or entirety of a basketball season, if player X's mom or sister is ill or is in this high risk situation, now that's 5-6 months that you're without your family, that you have to separate yourself. And in full, if we're being honest, do you really think that the NCAA is going to regulate that these athletes separate themselves in the way that would, in a way that would actually be beneficial?
I mean, why would the NCAA feel they have to if they look at the NBA and leagues like Major League Baseball, where their players are already getting together and doing workouts, and you see the footage that some of the teams have put out, there's not really much social distancing. They're not taking many precautions. I haven't seen a mask at batting practice yet from all the videos the teams have been tweeting out. So if those leagues don't feel like they have to really enforce anything, those teams don't, I don't think the NCAA will, or the teams in the NCAA will.
And the NCAA nor the school has any sort of legal standing to say you can only go to the stadium and then you can only go to your room and then you have to stay there.
Right.
It's unrealistic. And once you start saying, we're going to limit your movements, it's a whole, host of issues that universities and the NCAA doesn't want to deal with.
And then I mentioned it earlier, they feel like they can safely bring back fans in somewhat of a capacity. I think it was Ohio State that said they could fit 30% capacity or around that number into the horseshoe and still be safe. And some sports leagues have already started to try to deal with that. NASCAR has had some fans that select tracks, but that's up to the tracks and not NASCAR itself. But I don't think that can be done effectively throughout a whole football season. It helps at least that it's outdoors and you can be spaced out. But if they try to do that for basketball, I think that'll be even worse, trying to bring back the fans, much less the effects it will have on the kids and the students.
You can space them out once they're in the stadium, but how do you deal with them at concessions?
Exactly.
How do you deal with getting them in the gate? I mean, there's all of these other things. And if you go to football, part of going to football is tailgating. Like, are you going to forbid tailgating? People will tailgate somewhere off campus, right? You're not going to stop all of these things that go in inherent. So great. I'm glad you can get Ohio State seats 100,000 at this point.
Mm-hmm.
So cool. You can get 30,000 people, but how are you going to get those people through the gate safely and effectively? And it's logistics. I'm glad I don't have to figure out.
And sadly, I feel like a school will have, we can get 30% of you in, but in the school's mind, it's, we don't care about you until you're in the stadium. And then if you're not in our stadium, you're not our responsibility, even though they're coming to that event for them.
Yeah. And it sort of goes back to, though, what the school can't, they can say, like at Indiana, they could close down the tailgate fields and they could close down all of that. But who's to say, they have no control over what people do off campus.
Mm-hmm.
So if people still want to tailgate, what's to say they won't find, an empty parking lot or an abandoned field or set up shop in their driveway before they come to the stadium? The university can't stop that.
And even
go ahead, Drew.
I was gonna say, even once you get in the stadium, you can admit, 30% of the stadium and just say, like, all right, we're going to distance. And I've been to Memorial Stadium enough to know that, like, by the end of the third quarter, you can definitely, like, social distance. That's not going to be an issue. But, beginning of a big game, you admit however many people into the student section, you can tell them to distance. But I've been a part of that. There's no way that people are just going to stand 6 feet apart and, like, be a part of the student section. And then imagining that's IU football, which isn't at the same level as a lot of these other sports. If you're going to try and tell students in the Horseshoe or the Big House or Beaver Stadium, you cannot stand near each other, but you have to be united as one student section, that's just not going to work out. And I think eventually people are going to just merge together. And at that point, what difference does it make if you have 30,000 or 100,000? They're all packed together.
Right, and the example, it's not college sports, but it's been driving me nuts ever since it's been announced, is for the Indy 500 being run later this year. They're admitting 50% capacity, which, good on them at first, and then you realize Indianapolis Motor Speedway sits 300,000 people for the Indy 500 normally. So I've been to that track when there are 100,000 people there for the NASCAR event, and there's not much social distancing going on then. There's a lot more room for sure, and it's possible, but like it's still tough with 100,000 people there. And I think just people in organizations and schools doing that kind of thing is insane, and it's just not going to help and make things worse.
And think about it from the fan perspective of why all the reasons we watch sports. One big thing that people do is because of the social aspect. So now you have the social aspect, and you got to say, well, you can be social from 6 to 8 feet apart. That's a rough sell for that social fulfillment that they're looking for.
And I feel like the Indy 500 and college football games are really great examples, because those are events in that community that are huge social gatherings. You can't watch the Indy 500 on TV in Indianapolis. You have to go to the track. And hopefully they get rid of that blackout rule, but it's that same deal where like that whole community comes together, and it's the same for Bloomington. You mentioned the tailgates. That's Bloomington community coming together. And that social aspect it can't really be the same. It can't be.
Don't hold me to this, but I think I read that they are still going to black out the Indy 500, even though they're only going to do 50. So, like I said, I might be misremembering that, but I think I read that.
They still have time to change that. So hopefully
they do.
That's just insane that they've ever done that.
I know baseball is having a similar issue, because a lot of people are saying, if I'm only getting 60 games this year and I'm not allowed in the stadium, can I at least watch it in my hometown? And they're not going to mess with blackout rules because they don't have to.
Right. And not everybody can download a VPN and say they're in one part of the world to watch a game. It's ridiculous. I was blacked out from Cincinnati Reds games viewing them in Kentucky, 3 hours away. Like, come on. But yeah, no, just the whole comeback process is going to be really rocky, and I feel like every day there's going to be new news, maybe some positive, but mostly negative, but that's just my opinion. Hopefully I'm wrong. But then now, what's been happening during this pandemic with all of the protests and Black Lives Matter movement and everything that's been happening, you mentioned it, you've studied athletes as activists, and a lot of athletes have been out being activists during all of this, during the BLM marches across the country. For example, Malcolm Brogdon, Jason Tatum, Jaylen Brown, a lot of NBA players. So when it comes to impacting societal change, there's a lot of modern examples of athletes who have been really important with that. And just go through some of those. I mean, obviously, off the top of the head, it's Colin Kaepernick.
Mm-hmm.
But who else is just as important, or just in recent history been out there doing the right thing?
Colin Kaepernick, obviously. LeBron. LeBron started pretty much voicing social issues and campaigning for social justice right around Trayvon Martin. I think that was his first. We've seen it spill over into different leagues. I know that Steph Curry has been pretty vocal throughout the pandemic. I know that he has gone to a couple different protests and a couple different marches. I think more and more athletes are starting to find their voice, as we seem to be in a period where, I don't want to say people are more accepting, because you have, I think, two sides of the coin on this. Either you're accepting and willing to listen, or you're not. Megan Rapinoe has always been a very loud voice. Sue Bird has been a loud voice. Some of the WNBA players have said they're not coming back to play this season because they feel their efforts can be focused better in their communities, advocating for social change and social justice. So, in at least this recent time, it almost seems like it's more the norm for athletes to start speaking up and advocating for change, rather than here's a Colin Kaepernick, here's a LeBron, here's one exception, and we'll see what happens. And we've seen that trickle down to the college level. Missouri was really the first big one a couple of years ago, when the football team protested and said, we're not going to play. And they advocated, and they were able to get that change at Mizzou. We're seeing that more on the college level of athletes saying, I'm not playing. I am not playing unless you make these changes, which is amazing. So,
on a big level with that, a bunch of Mississippi State players, I believe it was Mississippi State, said they wouldn't play for the team until Mississippi changed their state flag, which that legislation is getting passed now. They are working on changing it. Mm-hmm. So it is making a difference, at least contributing to making a difference.
Yeah, I mean, and for a bunch of different reasons, all of this, none of this is new, right? None of these problems cropped up in February, and none of them happened overnight, right? This has been long-standing, but it's almost like you got the pandemic and sports shutting down, and, more and more instances, for whatever reason, of why these instances of police brutality and George Floyd, it almost seems like we finally got to the boiling point, and here we are. And people that may not have been paying attention are now starting to pay attention. Mm-hmm. And there's a lot of different, reasonings behind that. There's a lot of really interesting thoughts behind that. But, all of a sudden, it seems like it's more okay to speak up. Usually when an athlete speaks up, right, speaks out against the grain, they run a huge risk. And it's not very prominent to see every athlete come out and advocate for change. But all of a sudden, that risk seems to be diminished.
Right. And a great example of that, and I have to give him some props for this, is Bubba Wallace in NASCAR. The last sport you'd expect to hear anything from, because of the stereotype of the redneck hick sport. Bubba Wallace started being active with his voice, the only black driver in the sport, at the top level at least. He spoke out against the Confederate flag, which had already been discouraged from being flown at tracks, but now it got straight up banned because he spoke out against it. And then he drove a car that said Black Lives Matter down the side. And as a NASCAR fan myself, if you'd have told me that was going to happen at any point in the sport's future, I would have said you were crazy. But if, like you said, the risk is gone for a lot of these athletes, for the most part.
Go with diminished, not gone.
Diminished. Because Bubba Wallace, especially speaking out, has gotten a lot of pushback, but mainly from the fans who are the stereotype pushed upon NASCAR, which is sad. And seeing the drivers wear Black Lives Matter shirts, and Bubba and his crew wear the I Can't Breathe shirts before a race, And then when Bubba Wallace, it looked like a hate crime had been committed against him, which thankfully it wasn't. Every driver in the garage stood behind him and said, "We are with you. We have your back," which was a beautiful stand of solidarity. And I think more and more through sports, that's happening. And a lot of athletes are speaking out. There are athletes admitting that they were wrong. Joey Votto of the Cincinnati Reds put an op-ed out in the Cincinnati Enquirer that said, "I used to not listen to this. I used to think it wasn't a big deal. But then I saw the video of George Floyd and my mind changed," and he admitted he was wrong. And I see a lot of athletes coming and a lot of people coming out and doing that because athletes are speaking out against it.
And look at Drew Brees. I mean, he came out again. And he said the same thing in 2016, that he didn't support Kaepernick kneeling, right? You should stand for the flag. And then he came back out again, at the beginning of all of this, and said, no, I still feel that way. Got the huge amount of pushback. And finally, 2 days later, now he was tweeting Donald Trump, telling Trump, "You're wrong. It's not about the flag." I'm like, wow, that was a 180-degree turnaround, but that was also pretty significant.
Right. When I saw that happen, I thought, wow, there's no coming back in that locker room, because there were teammates of his tweeting out like, "Drew, come on."
Yeah.
And really emotional videos.
Right.
But apparently behind the scenes, they had talks and they sat down together behind closed doors and it changed his mind. And that's really important for things like that to happen.
And I think one of the differences now, that I don't think the risk factor is entirely gone, and you still see athletes, putting out statements and say, "I understand that I might lose some fans for this, but I want to at least voice my opinion." But now it's no longer an isolated incident or an isolated player that you can pin it on. When Kaepernick first kneeled, everyone who was against it could then just come down on Kaepernick, and they did, and he was effectively out of the league a short time later. But now, I think as more and more athletes and more like social figures are coming through, it's a lot easier to get behind them, knowing that you aren't alone and you aren't going to be the singular person attacked. And I think now that more people are able to share their voice, that gives more people the at least it gives them the mindset that they can also be heard in the same situation.
And like you said, there are a lot of athletes coming out and doing this. And I think the bigger the names, the bigger the risk they may face. But there was one athlete, it was our freshman year in college, Drew. He was a backup catcher on the Oakland Athletics, Bruce Maxwell. And it was when Colin Kaepernick was still pretty big in the news. And he kneeled during a couple of national anthems during a series that he was called up for. And he spoke out, and nobody really listened because he was a smaller name. But there were still athletes willing to do it then. But now it's so many more. And I think Bruce Maxwell was effectively blackballed from Major League Baseball for that. Sent down to the minors, and I don't think he's been called up since for one reason or the other. There's no official reason, but
Right. No guarantee.
yeah. But now that more and more athletes like Bruce Maxwell can come out and join the bigger names, and it can become a much bigger movement.
I think it's probably also important to consider that we may also be in a state right now where more people are willing to listen, right? You just mentioned Drew Brees, that he went into the locker room and he had these conversations. And I've seen stories about that coming across with different coaches and different teammates and different teams of they're taking the time to sit down and listen. And none of these issues are right or wrong, right? It's not binary, right? There's not one side and the other. There's all of these levels of nuance and shade in between. And so, when you look at Colin Kaepernick kneeling against the flag, it was either he's unpatriotic or it's his right. But there's all of these levels in between. So I think here, at least too, if people are willing to listen, right, and not just say, but he's wrong, right? Well, they're kneeling because X, Y, and Z, but starting to listen to that message, that's also helpful too. Mm-hmm. And not everybody's willing to listen, but it seems like more people are willing to maybe stop and consider what's being said and stop and consider. There was a tweet yesterday, and I forget who it was. It was a baseball player, and he wrote a pretty significant post about systemic racism and systemic issues in Major League Baseball.
I believe that might have been Ian Desmond of the Colorado Rockies.
Yeah. I mean, people that are willing to sit down and read that and go, oh, and not just blow it off, that starts a conversation, right? And that starts that possibility that we start moving towards change.
Mm-hmm. and I think we're also in more of a time now, which a large part of that is being open to listening, where some of these cases of players who are discriminated against or players who have to suffer through issues like this, X many years ago, it was just like, oh, that sucks. Sorry that happened to you. But now it's like, okay, let's address this because this isn't just an isolated event. I know Adam Jones has spoken out about hearing racial slurs in Fenway Park. I mean, just throughout baseball, but I know Fenway Park's been mentioned by a couple other athletes as a place that there have been fans who have been, very, very vulgar and racist to opposing players. And so
And
now
that
that's
was tough because the Red Sox put out a statement that said that was all true and that they're going to work on the culture in their ballpark.
which that's a big thing.
For an organization to admit that that's happening in your arena or ballpark or stadium, that's pretty huge to me, at least.
Exactly. And I've seen, other cases of this. I remember a few years ago in the tennis world, a former American tennis player, James Blake, was tackled and arrested by police. And it turned out to just be a misidentification. But there was like security video of it, of him standing just like standing by the door waiting, and then all of a sudden just getting tackled. And at the time that was like, sorry, Mr. Blake, that's highly unfortunate. But now it becomes an issue as, it's becoming a large part of this. And I've heard Blake speak out about similar issues as well. And I think people are more willing to listen to his voice as someone who's directly dealt with this, as opposed to let's watch this viral video of a guy getting tackled.
Right. And I think the one thing that stands out to me is we learned about this in your classes, some of the history of this. Going back to 1968 with Tommy Smith and John Carlos on the Olympic podium holding up their fists. Muhammad Ali in Louisville was a huge part of changing during the civil rights movement. I mean, it's kind of history repeating itself, but on a bigger scale. At least that's how I see it, with so many people who have voices and platforms, and they're using it to get this message across. But I mean, I don't have much more on this other than it's great, and I hope it continues. Even when sports get started back up, it doesn't distract from these issues. I know, at least with NASCAR, fortunately, it really hasn't, because every week Bubba's been kind of a focus. And I know the NBA is talking about putting social justice campaigns and slogans on their jerseys, which would be pretty huge. I don't think the NFL is doing anything, and I don't know if they will.
I know I saw real quick with the NBA, I know I saw there was talks about, painting or writing Black Lives Matter, somewhere out on the court. Because then I saw some fans say, if the Jazz do this, I'm never watching a Jazz game again. And then Donovan Mitchell just responded, okay, goodbye.
Right.
I think that's good that that's sort of becoming the message now, is it's like, you can't hold the league ransom because you disagree with such a basic message as well.
And that was NASCAR's issue. They were scared they were going to lose half of their base when they banned the Confederate flag. But now they're coming out and saying Black Lives Matter. They've joined a movement with You Can Play, a pride organization in sports, making it inclusive for LGBTQ plus individuals. I mean, organizations now, say what you want about them, but they're at least trying, and they're saying to the fans who are racist or unwilling to think that, okay, we don't need you, we don't want you here. And I think that's part of the change going on, and I think that's really huge right now.
It's a long road, right? It doesn't, something we don't snap our fingers on June 30th and all of a sudden on July 1st everything's magically kumbaya better. With regards to the NFL, the only thing I've seen is that players have said that they will kneel, but the only thing I've seen from the NFL was Roger Goodell's hostage video, for lack of a better term, of where, the player said, we want you to say this, and then here he was in his basement all fuzzy going, I'm reading this like I'm being held against my will. But it's the NFL, and as, not to get extremely political, but as we go into a political season, the NFL fan base skews fairly conservative. There's a lot of military money that funnels into the NFL for these displays of nationalism and patriotism. So, what kind of blowback is going to happen then?
All right, and NASCAR is another one of those sports where they have service members at every race, and they make a big deal out of being patriotic and with the military. And if they can do this, surely the NFL can, right?
You would think.
And, yeah. And then also with Major League Baseball, I haven't seen anything they're thinking of doing. And that might be a reason why Ian Desmond, it was him who put out that long message, is sitting out to focus on this and isn't comfortable with the whole COVID situation as well. I mean, that's the main thing, is we can't, as much as sports are an escape and a distraction, they can't be that same escape and distraction. They should be used, and this is all my opinion, they should be used as a signal boost to the issues going on in the country. Yeah, you can get your basketball, you can get your race, you can get your baseball game, but at the end of the day, you have to look at what's happening around you and go, okay, this needs to change. And if the leagues can help with that, I think that's the most important thing.
Mm-hmm.
It would be really powerful.
Yeah, I think it's more so becoming a reflection of a society rather than an escape from it. As we're now, I think the idea was that it should be an escape from it, and now as we're getting more discussion into a lot of these social issues, I think it's becoming this sort of reflection, as we're seeing a lot of Black athletes, sort of standing up and being like, this needs to be addressed. And another thing that you mentioned a couple minutes ago is the LGBT plus community, which does not historically have a strong presence in sports. And I know we just a couple days ago, I just saw the MLB did a long post about Glenn Burke, who was a gay baseball player and effectively ended up, he had an injury and then never really came back. But there's a lot of speculation that was just because players did not want him on their team in their locker room.
Well, it's interesting. His story is interesting because the players loved him. Dusty Baker was one of his favorite teammates. They were best friends. Another fun fact with Glenn Burke is he invented the high five.
Exactly.
Which is a great part of his story. But his story really boils down to Tommy Lasorda didn't like him.
Yeah.
Which is tough, and he's got a really hard story to go through. But yeah, it's nice to see organizations pointing that out too, that LGBT individuals are important to them and important to being a fan. And there's one account that's really big in that, and it's Minor League Baseball's account. They're huge during Pride Month and all the time, really, tweeting out promotions and messages of compassion and love. And then there will be nasty comments in those posts, and they'll go into the comments and say, we just want all of our fans to feel comfortable, and try to speak to these people who are pretty much unreasonable, which has always stuck out to me as like a yearly thing that they do, where they have to deal with a bunch of people in their comments who are really nasty. But yeah.
One of my colleagues said a couple weeks ago that the wisdom was always that sport is a microcosm of society, but maybe we've moved to the point now where society has become a microcosm of sport. And so if we can enact change, right, not only enact change and enact, pushes for change and inclusion and equality, sport is a powerful platform to do that. On the flip side, though, you have to still, I think going forward, still be willing to listen, right? Listen to what people are saying, and don't just, even if it's not your viewpoint, listen. Just listen to what the other person or the other side has to say. Nobody's saying you have to change your mind. Unless you're racist, then you should change your mind. But whatever your thought is, be willing to listen. And I think that's how change will start to get enacted. I'm very interested to see what happens at the college level with college athletes speaking up, because that's interesting and powerful and important. So
yeah,
you've got a lot of content for Sports Media and Society.
I do.
For that class when it comes back.
I do.
I don't know how that lesson plan is going to go, because when we took it, it was pretty packed, but things have just changed so much, even in the 2 years since we've taken it, that it might be a completely different class.
In the 6 months since we've
yeah
had to stay home,
Yeah.
But yeah, I think that's all I've got. Drew, do you have anything before we wrap up?
No, I think the key that we've mentioned is just listening, and I'm looking forward to seeing how the leagues sort of respond to this. Going back to our earlier subject in the show, college athletes returning, I really do wish the best for all of it. One, because selfishly I want sports, but two, I want to be able to see everything come together in one piece that actually functions. And there's some risks being taken. So we'll see how those play out.
Mm-hmm. And Lauren, do you have anything to close with?
I will just implore all you guys and implore your age group to please wear a mask and please be safe, because the more you do that, the quicker we can come back to normalcy. So wear your mask. It's
Right,
cool.
the quicker we can all get back into Assembly Hall for a game.
Exactly.
Well, thanks everybody for tuning in. Drew and I will see you later this week. Stay safe out there. Thanks for watching and have a good day.